Solomon Gaines was 38 years old the morning his grandfather pressed a single folded bill into his hand, closed both of Solomon's hands around it, and said, "What you do with that will tell me everything I need to know." The bill was $100. The man who gave it was Augustine Gaines, 71 years old, founder of Gaines Logistics and Property Group, a privately held company operating across 6 states that his 4 grandsons had spent the better part of a decade positioning themselves to inherit. Augustine had built the company from a single truck and a rented warehouse in Nashville in 1974, and he had watched, from the quiet distance of a man who understood observation as a form of intelligence, what the accumulation of his life's work had done to the people who expected to receive it. He had given the same bill to Solomon's 3 older brothers. He had watched each of them take it. He had watched what each of them did next, without saying a word to any of them about the others. 3 of the 4 had no idea that a $100 bill and 30 days of watching was about to determine who controlled an estate valued at $47 million. What the 3 older brothers, Darnell, Marcus, and Terrence, did not know, and what none of their attorneys or their weekend conversations or their careful calculations had accounted for, was that Augustine Gaines had spent a lifetime reading men the way other men read contracts, and that he had already known the answer before he gave the first bill. He was simply waiting for his grandsons to confirm it. What Solomon did next, and what Augustine did with everything he had built, is a story about what a man's character looks like when he thinks no one important is watching. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from, and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The sun came up early in late June, and Augustine Gaines sat on the back porch of the house on Magnolia Avenue that he had purchased in 1981 and had never once considered leaving, and he drank his coffee from the same ceramic mug he had used every morning for 11 years. A mug his late wife Celestine had bought at a church fair, and that had survived every move and renovation the house had seen since. The porch was one he had built himself in 1986, pressure-treated lumber, a rail he had milled from a fallen oak in the backyard, a floor that had been restained 4 times and still held. He had built it on 3 weekends while his 4 grandsons' fathers were still young men, before the company had grown large enough to require his full attention on Saturdays. He had built it with the understanding that a man who could not tend his own house had no business managing other people's. The porch had outlasted 2 of his neighbors' houses and 3 city administrations, and 1 storm that had taken the large pecan tree in the front yard down to the roots. He sat with his coffee and his thoughts, and the particular stillness that came to a man who had spent 50 years in motion and had finally earned the right to be still. Celestine had died 4 years prior, in the front bedroom, with the window open because she had always wanted the morning air when she slept. She had been the one who told him, early in their marriage, when the company was still 1 truck and a great deal of uncertainty, that the character of a man was visible in how he treated people who could do nothing for him. She had said it once, and never needed to say it again. It had been enough. He kept her photograph on the shelf inside the back door, where he passed it every morning coming in and every evening going out. He had not moved it in 4 years. His 4 grandsons had grown up in this house in the summers, around this porch, in the kitchen where Celestine made breakfast every morning, whether they asked for it or not. She had never distinguished between them in the kitchen. She had fed every one of them the same plate and asked every one of them the same questions about their days and listened to every answer with the same attentiveness. Augustine had watched all of it from the chair at the end of the table and had noted year by year what the boys did with that equal treatment, which ones received it as their due, and which one quietly helped clear the plates afterward without being asked. He had watched them grow from boys into men with the particular attentiveness of someone who understood that character was not a thing that appeared suddenly at the moment of a test. It was assembled over decades, in small decisions, in the gaps between observation, in what a person did when they believed the lesson had already concluded. Darnell was 44, the oldest. He had his grandfather's height, and the confidence that came from having been called impressive his entire life by people who confused bearing with substance. He had worked in the company's property division for 12 years and had done the work competently, in the way of someone who understood what was required to hold a position, but had not, in 12 years, attempted anything beyond what was required to hold it. He spoke in meetings with the authority of a man who had inherited access and had gradually come to believe that the access was the accomplishment. Marcus was 42, meticulous in everything visible: his dress, his timing, his language in formal settings, and in the way he positioned himself within family conversations to appear reasonable while ensuring the architecture of every outcome served his interests. He was the kind of man who never asked for anything directly, and yet always seemed to arrive at having received what he wanted. Augustine had spent a decade watching how that was managed, and had developed a precise understanding of the mechanism behind it. Terence was 40 and the most openly ambitious of the three older brothers, which in some ways made him the most legible. 18 months ago, he had hired his own attorney for purposes he described to family members as general planning, and did not describe further. Augustine had learned of it through the company's general counsel, who had mentioned it with the measured neutrality of someone delivering information they understood to be significant. Terence had not told his grandfather. He had told no one in the family. He had simply begun preparing. Solomon was 38. He had been running the logistics division of Gaines Logistics and Property Group for 9 years, having taken it over when it was operating at a consistent quarterly loss and having turned it, through the application of the same methodical attention he brought to everything, into the most profitable segment of the company. He drove a truck himself on short routes twice a week, a habit that puzzled his brothers and that he had never stopped doing, because he understood that the only way to manage a system was to have genuine knowledge of what it felt like from inside the system, not just from the reports that described it. He had not requested a title change or a meaningful increase in compensation during the 5 years it took to complete the turnaround. His grandfather had given him both anyway, without announcement, and Solomon had accepted them without theater. Augustine had known for 3 years who would receive the company. The $100 bills were not the test. They were the documentation. He called each grandson separately on a Tuesday in June and asked them to come by the house over the following week. He told each of them he had something to give them, nothing more. He gave them each the same envelope, containing the same folded $100 bill and the same words: "What you do with that will tell me everything I need to know." He said it to all 4, with equal weight, in the same kitchen, at the same table, and then he waited. What came back to him over the following 30 days was more complete than even he had expected. Darnell took the bill and looked at it with the brief assessment of a man who had not needed $100 for a long time, and then produced a practiced expression of gratitude, warm at the surface, performed at the foundation, the kind that a person with decades of experience reading expressions could identify immediately. He put it in his jacket pocket. Augustine noted the pocket. The following weekend, the company's operations manager, a straightforward man named Gerald, who had been with the company for 18 years and had the particular loyalty of someone who had been treated fairly across a long relationship, mentioned to Solomon in passing that Darnell had been asking the property division's office manager about the timeline for the estate planning process. Gerald had heard it secondhand and had not been sure whether to say anything. Solomon had thanked him and said nothing further to anyone. Solomon mentioned it to Augustine on his next Thursday visit, without editorializing, in the same tone he used to report a route delay or a warehouse inventory discrepancy. Marcus called Augustine 3 days after receiving his bill to ask, in the careful language of a man who had rehearsed the question until it sounded spontaneous, whether the $100 was meant to be kept as a keepsake or deposited for use. Augustine answered the literal question, but what he heard underneath it was a different question entirely. A question about what the bill signified, about what the test was measuring, about whether there was a correct answer that could be produced on demand. He recognized the phone call for what it was within the first 40 seconds. He had not raised the question of the estate during the call. He had not needed to. The positioning was audible without it. Marcus's call lasted 9 minutes. The note Augustine wrote in the folder afterward was 4 words. He knows it's a test. Terence had said nothing after receiving his bill. No call, no visit, no message of any kind. 11 days after their Tuesday meeting, the company's general counsel received a letter from an attorney Augustine did not recognize. The letter was addressed to the company formally, used proper legal salutation, and requested documentation regarding the succession structure of Gaines Logistics and Property Group under applicable Tennessee trust and estate law. The letter was courteous and specific in a way that made plain that Terence's attorney had been given detailed briefing. His face remained perfectly calm when he read it. Augustine set the letter on the kitchen table and sat with it for a moment in the quiet of the house on Magnolia Avenue. The house where all 4 of these boys had eaten breakfast 100 times. And he felt something that was not exactly grief and not exactly disappointment, and was perhaps simply the final confirmation of something he had been observing for a very long time. He placed the letter in the folder. He labeled the folder in the careful handwriting he had used for 50 years of company correspondence. He wrote on the tab, "Trust, supporting record." Then he picked up the phone and called Solomon. Solomon came on a Thursday evening after his second driving route of the week, still wearing the company jacket with the Gaines Logistics patch on the shoulder that he wore on those days. He sat across from his grandfather at the kitchen table where they had eaten hundreds of meals and said nothing until Augustine was ready to speak. "Tell me what you did with it," Augustine said. Solomon was quiet for a moment. Then, he said, "I stopped at the gas station on the way home that first evening. There was a woman outside with 2 children. Her card declined when she tried to pay. I gave the 100 to the cashier for her account and left before she had a chance to see who paid it." Augustine looked at his grandson for a long moment. "That's what I thought," he said. He told Solomon what the 3 brothers had done. He told him about Darnell's questions to the estate, and Marcus's positioning call, and Terence's attorney's letter. He told him about the folder on the table and what it contained and what he intended to do with it. He told him about the conversation he had already had with his own attorney, a woman named Claudette Marsh, who had been managing Augustine's personal legal affairs for 16 years and who had prepared the documentation for a trust restructure that Augustine had authorized 3 months prior, before the $100 bills had been distributed. Solomon listened to all of it without interrupting. "You already decided before the test," he said when his grandfather finished. "I needed the record," Augustine said, "so that when the time came, no one could say the decision was arbitrary. Some things you built not because you needed them to stand, but because you needed everyone else to see that they could." The following week, Claudette sat at Augustine's kitchen table with 3 manila folders and her yellow legal pad and walked him through the final structure of the Augustine Gaines Revocable Trust with specific distribution provisions, a document she had been preparing in iterations over the prior 4 months. Refining language each time Augustine brought her a new piece of documentation for the supporting record folder. Claudette Marsh had been Augustine's personal attorney since 1988, when she was 27 years old, and had just opened her practice, and Augustine was still driving the second truck himself on Friday routes because one of his drivers had called out. She had drawn up his first property acquisition agreement at a kitchen table not unlike this one, and she had been present at every significant legal moment of his professional life since. She was 63 now, and had the precise, unhurried quality of a person who had spent 4 decades in rooms where careful language was the difference between a life's work being protected and being dismantled. She walked him through every provision. She explained the structure of the sole managing trustee designation and why it was more durable than a co-trustee arrangement. She explained the 15-year distribution schedule for the 3 older grandsons and the performance-linked calculation that tied those distributions to the company's results under Solomon's management, a provision she had suggested herself, and which Augustine had accepted immediately because it aligned the incentives of all 4 grandsons with the company's health rather than with internal competition. She explained the 3 specific provisions she had built into the document to address the most likely challenge scenarios. The first addressed undue influence. The second addressed testamentary capacity. The third was a no-contest clause that reduced the distribution of any beneficiary who mounted an unsuccessful legal challenge to the trust. Can they break it? Augustine asked. Claudette set down her pen. Not if they act within the next 90 days, she said. After filing, they would need to establish undue influence or diminished capacity, and the supporting record you have assembled, the attorney letter, the estate inquiry, the positioning call, constitutes contemporaneous evidence that defeats both theories. She paused. You documented your own clarity. That is not something most people think to do in advance. I built a company by not waiting for problems to present themselves before thinking about them, Augustine said. She nodded once. Then file it. He signed on a Wednesday morning with the same deliberate hand he had brought to every significant signature of his life. Claudette witnessed it. Gerald, the operations manager, served as the second witness, a choice Augustine had made because Gerald had been honest about what he had heard and had not been required to be, and Augustine believed in rewarding that quality when he had the opportunity. After Claudette left, Augustine sat on the porch for a long time with his coffee growing cold beside him and thought about 50 years of work and the particular texture of a decision that has been correctly made. He thought about Celestine and the way she had said it. The arrangement, not the accumulation. He thought about a gas station on a Tuesday evening and a woman with 2 children and a card that had declined, and a grandson who had walked away before she could see who had paid. Preparation is the work. He had prepared. The work was done. 3 days before the trust reading, he sat across from Solomon at the same kitchen table and told him everything. The folder, the provisions, the distribution schedule, the 3 brothers' challenges that Claudette anticipated. He told him because Solomon would be managing 4 family relationships while also managing a $47 million company, and he deserved to walk into that room with full knowledge rather than partial information. Solomon listened to all of it without changing his expression. When his grandfather finished, he was quiet for a moment. You didn't have to give the test at all, Solomon said. I gave it for the record, Augustine said, and because I wanted to see it with my own eyes one more time. He looked at his youngest grandson. I wanted to see what you did when you thought it was just $100. Solomon looked at the table. It was just $100, he said. That was exactly what Augustine had known he would say. The reading of the trust took place in Claudette's conference room on a Friday morning in September, 6 weeks after Augustine had signed. He was present. All 4 grandsons were present. Each of the 3 older brothers had brought his own attorney, which Claudette had anticipated, and for which she had prepared accordingly, arranging extra chairs on one side of the table, with the particular calm of a person who had spent 4 decades being the most prepared person in whatever room she occupied. The room was quiet when Augustine came in. He sat at the head of the table without ceremony and looked at each of his grandsons. Darnell with his arms crossed in a posture he likely believed communicated calm. Marcus with his hands folded and his expression composed to neutral. Terence watching Claudette's folder with the focused attention of someone who had been briefed on its probable contents, and then at Solomon, who sat with his hands open on the table and his eyes on his grandfather. Claudette read the document in full. She did not summarize. She did not abbreviate. She read every word of every provision in the measured, precise voice she brought to formal readings, and the room was absolutely still while she did it. It took 22 minutes. No one spoke. When she finished, Darnell spoke first. He said the document did not reflect what their grandfather would have wanted with a clear mind, that the process had lacked the kind of family consultation that a decision of this significance deserved, and that the family needed time to understand the full picture before anything was treated as final. Augustine looked at his eldest grandson with the same unhurried steadiness he had brought to every difficult conversation of his life. "You're looking at the full picture," he said. Marcus said there were conversations that should have happened before any document was signed. "There were conversations," Augustine said. "You chose to have yours with attorneys. I chose to have mine with the people I trusted." He paused. "The results are in the document." Terence said nothing. His attorney leaned close and said something in a low voice. Terence shook his head once, a barely perceptible motion, and sat back. Solomon sat with his hands open on the table and did not speak. He had not needed to. He understood that the room had been arranged before anyone walked into it, and that what was happening now was not a negotiation, but a reading of what had already been decided and properly documented. Augustine looked at each of the three older grandsons in turn, with the long, clear, unhurried look of a man who had built something real and had spent 71 years understanding what the word real required. Then he said, "I built something worth keeping. I gave it to someone worth keeping it." He stood and straightened his jacket, the same jacket he had worn to every significant meeting of his professional life, dark and simple and well-fitted, the jacket of a man who understood that presentation was the minimum and substance was the point. "Claudette will answer your questions." He walked out of the conference room. He did not look back. The room was quiet behind him. 9 months passed like water settling after a stone. The legal challenges came, as Claudette had predicted they would. Darnell's attorney filed a petition asserting undue influence in the first month. It was dismissed with prejudice in the third, the contemporaneous record proving more thorough than the petition's authors had anticipated. Marcus withdrew from the process entirely by month 4, having calculated, apparently, that the annual distribution income was more reliable than the outcome of a challenge he was unlikely to win. Terence's attorney continued the longest, filing 2 separate amended petitions that were each addressed by provisions Claudette had specifically written to anticipate them. The second dismissal came in month 8, and after that, the legal activity stopped. Solomon assumed operational control of Gaines Logistics and Property Group on the first day of the new year. His first act as managing trustee was to increase the compensation of the company's 43 drivers by 12% across the board, funded by a reduction in the administrative overhead that he had identified during his 9 years running the logistics division and had been waiting for the authority to address. The second act was to rename the Nashville warehouse, the original one, the one Augustine had rented in 1974 before he owned anything, the Celestine Gaines Operations Center, a decision he had discussed with no one except his grandfather, who had said yes before Solomon finished the sentence. Augustine sat on the back porch on Magnolia Avenue on a morning in early spring and drank his coffee from Celestine's mug and watched the light, come across the yard where the pecan tree had stood and thought about a Tuesday in June and 4 envelopes, and what $100 revealed about a man when the man believed the observation had already ended. He had built everything he intended to build. It was in the right hands. A woman named Miriam sat beside him on the porch he had built in 1986, reading the morning paper and not requiring the quiet to be filled with anything. She was a retired schoolteacher he had known for 40 years, who had moved back to Nashville from Richmond the previous winter, and who had accepted his invitation to Sunday dinner 3 months ago and had been coming back every Sunday since. She understood the value of a porch built to last. She appreciated the mug. She did not need to be told things twice. He held his coffee with both hands and watched the light do what morning light did on a yard that had been tended for a long time by people who loved it. Character, Celestine had said, is what a man does when he thinks the lesson is already over. Solomon had passed the test before he knew he was being given one. That was the only kind of passing that counted. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.